Maine Public All Books Considered Book Club. I'm Cindy Hahn, and I'm very happy to be talking with author Morgan Talty this evening about his book, Night of the Living Rez. We know there's a ton of interest in this book club tonight because of Morgan's book and all the attention he's gotten. Morgan he lives here in Maine. He grew up in the Penobscot Indian Nation, and his stories have appeared in many journals. Some of those stories are in the book. He's also an assistant professor in creative writing and Native American literature at University of Maine, Orono. And let's see what else we can talk about. I guess this is your first book, and there's lots of questions coming in, so I don't want to take too long with that introduction. But thank you so much for joining us, Morgan.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me.
Sure. And I'm just going to make a quick note about some thank yous. We want to thank our sponsor, Bull Moose, and also the bookstore partners who are joining us: Book Stacks, Left Bank Books, None Such Books and More, Print, Sherman's Maine Coast Bookshops, and DDG Booksellers in Farmington. And as far as those of you who do want to send in questions for Morgan today, we are only showing this conversation on YouTube this time, not on Facebook Live as well. So if you're registered on YouTube, you can put your questions here, but also you can email us at fun@mainepublic.org and send in those questions for Morgan. Like I said, we've got lots already. Morgan, your book has really piqued a lot of people's curiosity, and really all I'm hearing are positive reactions. But let's start with some questions for you. And just the first one is to just tell us what led you to write this collection of stories.
Yeah, so I've always, I would say, considered myself a storyteller, and I think by the time I got to college, I realized that I could tell stories and that I could maybe, make a living out of it, or in some way make some change from it. And so I decided to pursue it. And, I studied writing at Eastern Maine Community College, and then on at Dartmouth College, and then I got my MFA. And I guess storytelling is just in my nature. And this just so happened to be, there was a lot of stuff I wrote before this book, a lot of failed attempts at novels and other stories, just terrible writing. But this was the first thing that I was, adequately prepared to write and put out into the world.
And why do you feel, what struck you as, okay, this feels right? What made you feel like you were ready with this collection?
Mainly people were telling me, they were like, oh, you have something here. And for me, I just felt, I started publishing. I started, these stories started appearing in magazines, and journals that are, not the easiest journals to get, acceptances into. And so I realized, because when I started writing when I was 18 or 19, I'm 31 now. And, I used to submit when I first started writing, and it took me 8 years to get my first ever acceptance. It took me 9 years to get, an acceptance in like a big magazine. And so it was sort of like people were telling me, the book was like, these stories were good, but I had also sort of like realized I'd gotten to a point where I was like, okay, I'm not an amateur, I guess, I don't know if that's the right word, but like I was like proficiently like creating work that was good. And so I just knew from people telling me, and from me also just sort of like, I guess, kind of like knowing, that it was time, and that I was in my place. And I'm always still, getting better at writing. And I feel like I always want to write something better than the last thing. This just so happened to be the first one that I could put out there.
And were you setting out with this book then to say, okay, I'm going to assemble these stories to paint a picture of life on the reservation? That was the goal, or what did you have in mind when you put them together?
Yeah, so my goal wasn't so much to highlight, the Penobscot Nation and the Penobscot culture. I mean, that was a small part of it. My goal was really, to get at the heart of these characters who are Penobscot, and who are, bound by issues that are both individual, issues that stem from colonization, issues that exist in Indian country, but are not indicative of Indian country or, speak for Indian country. I think for me, I was very, very careful with writing this book and writing these stories and positioning them in a way where no one could be like, oh, this isn't, I can't believe you wrote this about our people. And, like for me, everything always came back to the characters and the things they experience. And, I'm always, quick to be like, this isn't like this isn't, as much as the book may like to say on the back that this is, a glimpse into the Penobscot experience in the 21st century, that's, not really true all the way. It's partly true, the cultural elements, the language, but the what the characters suffer with, what they deal with, is not, a purely Penobscot thing. The one thing I will say that I think is a Penobscot and cultural element in this book is the care that these characters have for each other and the compassion and the love that they have even when things are at their darkest.
That really stands out, that you sort of walk this fine line so that it doesn't turn into a big stereotype and say, oh, these are the problems happening, but there's this glimmers of humanity and love and tenderness, and that sort of, it seems like that's how you walked that line.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, really successfully. I'll go right to a question from one of the readers because I think everybody wants to ask this question. This is from Sam in Saco, Samantha. How much of the book is based off real life events?
Hi, Samantha. Great question. All of it, 100% autobiographical. No, it's it's mostly fiction, I'd say. I think there are elements there are moments in the book that are true, right? That they've come from my own experience. But, I think thematically, if we look at the themes of the book about addiction and alcohol addiction and drug addiction, substance abuse, violence, those, all of those terrible things, I have some relationship to. The incidents that we see them in are not incidences I necessarily experience, but I'm familiar with them. And so thematically, there is a lot of autobiographical element to it in that I know these things in an intimate way. It just so happens that I chose to use fiction and make things up to capture those themes. But there are, like I said, things in here that are pretty, there are moments that mirror, things that had actually happened in real life. And two examples I give to show the difference, or like the extent. The story Safe Harbor, which is about Dee visiting his mother when she's in a crisis stabilization unit. That story all the way up until the part where Dee leaves and there's, spoiler alert, the accident and all that stuff, was something that I had experienced. My mom, when she was alive, suffered from severe depression, and she often would go to a crisis stabilization unit to get away and to get rest. And I would go up and visit, and we'd drink coffee and color and hang out and talk, watch TV. And, I was always bringing her cigarettes. And when I went up there one day, I saw her have a seizure. And it was the most terrible. For anybody who's seen anybody have a seizure, how terrifying that is. And when I got home that day, I wrote everything down from the moment I talked to her in the morning and how she wanted me to bring her cigarettes for her friend and also for her, and the whole drive there and everything. I wrote everything that I could remember. That guy, that exterminator that was there doing something with these black boxes, all the way up until the moment until she had the seizure. I mean, even what's written on the board in the story, a ship in harbor is safe, but that's not what ships are built for. That was an actual line that was there, and I remembered it. I wrote it down, and I wrote it all the way to the part that she had the seizure, and then for like a year, I was like, I don't know what to do with this story. And then finally, I was like, I wonder if I can push it, and I wonder if I could take this material and turn it into something even more. And I wrote, the rest of it, and the rest of it's fiction. Um, and I had to go back and obviously revise some of the stuff early on, and make that a little fictional as well to match the pattern of it. So that's pretty accurate. Like a very sort of like that came from my life. In Smokes Last, the battles. My friends and I used to have battles in the
With the
woods with
sticks.
sticks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, there's glimmers of it here and there.
So, for example, with your mom, was it therapeutic for you to write it all down right away? Or is it just the writer in you that felt like I have to, put this in words? Or why did you do that to write it?
I think it was because like I feel like I write a lot of the time to understand, or to try to come to an understanding about something. And that was one of those moments where it was like I don't think I would have been able to come to an understanding based off of a memory. I was like, I need to have like notes. I need to have something. And I do that a lot. I have a running list on my phone of stuff that I see or hear or deal with or encounter, all of these things. And it's really, I mean, I guess it's therapeutic, not necessarily in the moment, but maybe down the line in some subconscious way. It helps me compartmentalize um trauma and tragedy and heartbreak, so that way I can, I guess, keep living, or find some type of joy out of that, out of those painful things.
Your relationship with your mom, I'm assuming you are very much of David and Dee, that's mostly you there in those characters. And the relationship with the mom, those are the most, I think, moving ones in the book. Is that very real to life of you and your mom?
I'd say the David and mom characters definitely are, and the D and the mom characters also are, except I was never in D's shoes when it came to the struggles he was struggling with, and the drug addiction and those things. But I cared very deeply for my mother, and that element, that care that David has for his mom, and the care that D, when he's in the right state of mind to see it, that he has for his mom, or as it's projected with Beth, because he cares a lot for her when Phyllis is not there, really stems, I think, from my deep appreciation for my mother.
And how have the people that you grew up with reacted to the book and how you portray the community?
Everybody's been kind and nice, and I haven't gotten any death threats yet or anything. I haven't, nobody's threatened to beat me up at Hannaford. Nobody sent me notes with like cut out newspaper letters with like I don't know, saying bad stuff. Everyone has been really supportive, and for those who haven't, or for those who have not really liked the book, have not said anything. And yeah, I think to be a writer, you have to have tough skin, but this has all been, I guess, highly supportive. So my thick skin, tough skin has not had to repel anything.
Okay. Here's a question from Loring Danforth. He's a professor of anthropology emeritus at Bates College, and he writes, "Dear Mr. Talty, could you please discuss your decision to present the stories in the book out of sequence and as short stories rather than in chronological order as a novel? What guided your decisions as to the order you placed the stories in? And thank you for a powerful book."
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, so I'll try to make this as short as I can, but it's still as succinct as possible. I wrote the book. The first story I ever wrote for the book was Night of the Living Rez, which is the second to last story. And I wrote that in 2015. And it wasn't until I got into my MFA program in 2017 that I was like, I'm going to write a story collection. And I'd had a couple other David stories, namely Smokes Last and a story called It's All There, which was a failed really early rendition of The Blessing Tobacco, really just the relationship between David and Grammy, or Dee and Grammy.
Mhm.
And so I was like, okay, I'll write a story collection. I wanted to experiment with the short story. I had written two novels prior to that, and they both were just really, really bad. I was like, I just I didn't have the ability to do it yet. And for some reason I was like, oh well, short fiction must be easy, but it's not. Short fiction is as hard as writing a novel. And so I was like, okay, I'll write a story collection where each story stands alone, and my framework will be I'll move from David as a boy all the way until he's a young adult in Night of the Living Rez. So I did that. I wrote, In a Jar, where we see David come to the Penobscot Nation with his mom. I wrote probably like 14 or 15 stories all told from David's point of view. And when I finished the collection, I chose 10 that looked to be the best, because story collections tend to have 10 stories. Like that's the standard, I guess. And I looked at it and I was like, wow, this book sucks. It was so bad. It was not a good book. Like there were stories that were good, but it was just the same character, different situation, and there was nothing quite else. There was no overarching element. And the question then came to me, it's like, well, this people are going to read it and they're going to be like, well, this needs to be a novel. But I was like, I don't want to do a novel. And so I was like, all right, I'll set this project aside and we'll just leave it. And I went on to go do something else, and I wrote Burn. But in Burn, I kept wanting to call the protagonist David because I'd written for so long in his point of view. And I was like, but it's not David. And then eventually I was like, well, wait, maybe his name is, I was like, wait, maybe he goes by the name of D, because I put the letter D in as a placeholder until
Mhm.
I could figure his name out. And I was getting it ready. I was like, all right, I need to send this story out. I was like, what is this character's name? And I was like, well, is it D? Because I kept saying it in my head, and I was like, well, people go by that name. And I put two E's at the end of it, and I was like, oh, okay, it is D. And, it fit. And I was like, wait a minute, is this David all grown up? And I realized it was. And everything I had written, came back to life, because I now had this question of what happened. Like, how did we get from this good-natured boy, who is, in these situations with his family, to this guy who's trying to, swindle pot from this dealer over town, and then he comes across his friend whose hair's frozen, and this, like, how did we get here? And so I started writing these Dee and Fellis stories. I wrote, Burn, I wrote Get Me Some Medicine, I wrote In a Field of Stray Caterpillars, Earth Speak, maybe a dozen Dee and Fellis stories. And I was like, I want to navigate this question of how did we get here, not in a linear fashion. Like, I didn't want to do all David's story and then all these stories, because I felt like that like stole some of the power. Because I feel like the interesting thing about a short story is that short stories, as opposed to novels, get their strength from what's left out. And so for me to do it, with I was like, what if I do it almost like a zipper? It'll be like a David story, a D story, a David story, a D story, a David story, a D story, and each story standing alone, but at the same time there's still this suggestion of like, okay, we're moving somewhere, though, like we're moving towards something. And that something for me was always, how did we get here? Which is a central question that David asks, or D asks, in Half-Life. He's like,
Mhm.
maybe the question was, how do we get here, how do we get out of here? And so it just sort of, I don't know, like it was partly my decision to do that. It was also partly, I feel like, the story's decision. Like, agents had been like, oh, turn this into a novel and then maybe we can sell it. But the more I tried to turn the book into a novel, the more the stories began to break apart. Like, there was too much pressure being applied to like a 2x4. And I felt it. I heard it crackling. And I said, no, I'm not doing that. And I kept it the way it was, doing this back and forth structure. And that they stood alone, I think, kept at bay this whole idea of it needing to have um, an entire overarching narrative. I think novels tend to I was talking about this the other evening with Jonathan Escoffrey, who is the author of If I Survive You, which was just longlisted for the National Book Award. And I was moderating an event for him, and I think it was him. Yeah, I think it was him. Um, you know, actually, I don't know who it was. It was somebody. But he was like, somebody said, novels tend to put all their questions in the opening chapter, whereas interconnected stories don't. And with this book, there's just more questions. They keep coming and they keep coming, but they don't nag at you. And like I tried to nurture that element of this of that structure instead of trying to have it conform to some Western, archetypal model of storytelling that we see, constantly in, publishing, with, the exposition and conflict and rising action and climax and falling action and, resolution. I wanted to move away from that. And a reader once said, this is the last thing I'll say, a reader once said, I structured it this way because native storytelling isn't a linear thing. And I was like, all right, that works. That's a good way to answer it.
Even if you didn't think of it, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah, well, it is so interesting how you said it kind of told you what to do, right? It sort of spoke
yeah,
to you that this is how the story needs to be told. Well, it works in some kind of magical, confusing way.
yeah.
So that actually brings me to another question from a reader. Jean in Swanville said, when you spoke in Belfast, you talked about how you grew up hearing people tell stories. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like?
Yeah, I mean, it was always great to hear stories. I mean, when I went to school on the island, we had Native Studies class, and John Bear Mitchell was who's at the University of Maine now, but he was our teacher then, and he taught Native Studies, and was always telling stories, and he was a great storyteller. He was just he knew how to tell a story orally, and he was funny, and it was always, I just had a great time. Like I loved that stuff. And outside of school, just like I think anybody from a small community knows how stories function. And I'm not saying it's gossip, but how people talk and the way people, the way a story moves from one household to the next, from one person to the next. And I was just always so fascinated by that. But I was also super fascinated in retelling things that, I had seen. Me and my friends used to hang out in my shed, when we were teenagers, and steal cigarettes and smoke. And I remember just always being, like always being like, oh, do you remember that time we got, this kid to climb up in the tree and do whatever, and like just always, I found myself always telling stories, like always like sort of remembering what we had done. And like I feel like that's what's so important about storytelling, is it's like it's not just a form of entertainment, but it's actually a form of helping us remember, not just things that happen, but helps us remember, you know, our purposes. It helps us remember what it means to be human. It's just such a vital role.
Well, let's hear some of it. I understand you have a section you can read to us tonight.
Oh yeah. Um, so yeah, I'll read a small section. This is from In a Jar. So this is when David and his mom move to the Penobscot Nation, and we meet Frick, and eventually Paige, David's sister, who's about 10 years older than him, shows up, and there's a fight between mom and Paige, and mom locks herself in the room. And the only other thing you need to know if you haven't read this story is that early in the story, David lost a toy, like red alien figure behind the cement steps. And so I'll pick up here, and it's David and his sister in there in the house in the kitchen, and Grammy comes over, their grandmother. The door was open, and so Grammy came in. I hopped off the couch. Hi, son, she said. I gave her a hug. Paige turned off the sink faucet and dried her hands. When did you get here, Duz? Grammy said to Paige. A little while ago. Grammy walked over the linoleum with her shoes on and gave Paige a hug that said, It's nice to see you. Where's your mom? She asked. She's not feeling well. Grammy looked up the hallway. Something she ate, Paige said. Grammy said, mm-hmm. She stood in the doorway, and Paige asked if she wanted to sit down. No, no, Grammy said. I was coming to see if David wanted to go to the evening service at the church. She looked at me, and in looking at me, I was compelled to say yes. She was my Grammy after all. But I didn't want to go alone with her. Not because of her, but because it was church. I'll go if Paige goes, I said. Paige dropped her head and shoulders, shook her head. She went to her bedroom and changed. Grammy's car was a puttering two-door piece of rusted metal. I thought Paige's car was bad, but Grammy's was something else. The engine made this whining sound every few minutes, like a bomb siren. Her turn signals worked, but on the dashboard it didn't say if they were on or off. So sometimes she drove with her turn signal on for miles. Maybe she knew. Maybe she was messing with other drivers. Also, the radio turned on and off by itself, and after we drove in silence past the small health clinic and the large tin-looking community building and the tribal offices tucked behind thick pine trees and the tan brick school and the football field, we pulled into the church parking lot and the radio kicked on and blared out Meredith Brooks's Bitch, and Paige bobbed her head, telling Grammy to turn it up, but she flicked the radio off. Michiganasu, Grammy said, this shitty thing. We got out of the car and Grammy hurried in front of us. Paige walked by my side and whispered about gugooks, evil spirits. They follow Grammy around, she said to me. That's why the radio turned on. I tried not to be scared, but I was. Paige always talked about gugooks, and one reason why I never stayed at Grammy's house was because Paige said it was haunted. And when I told Mom that, she said the whole island was haunted, that years and years and years ago our people used this place as a graveyard, that even late at night she heard gugooks tapping on the walls. Mom told me not to be scared. In the church, we took our seats, and I thumbed through the Bible in front of me. Other than that, I didn't pay attention to anything, just watched people here and there, some with their eyes closed, some open. I didn't think Paige was listening either. Her head was turned sideways, half open, like the priest's word was putting her to sleep. After we'd lined up to receive the body of Christ, which I wasn't allowed to ingest, and instead received a pat on the head from the priest because Mom hadn't had me baptized, we returned to our seats. Paige nudged me. Grammy watched, hand on her chest, as Paige broke her cracker in half and gave it to me. It dissolved in my mouth, and it tasted like a chalky cracker that had gotten wet and had dried again. Paige saw the disgust in my face, and she whispered, "It's the best Jesus could do." "Jesus made this?" I said. Paige had her arms crossed. "I know, right?" Grammy told us to shut the heck up. Church dragged on. When we had to kneel, we knelt. When we had to sing, we sang. When we had to pray, we prayed. Grammy probably prayed for God to forgive Paige, and Paige probably prayed for a cigarette. Me, I prayed for the safe return of my alien figure in his red spacesuit. I still felt bad that he was all alone under those steps, buried in the cold mud, and I prayed that the change in seasons would churn him out to the surface and I'd find him one day. Toward the end of the service, we knelt one last time, sang one more prayer, but I didn't pray for anything because I couldn't focus. I smelled the stinky piggity, a fart. I had my eyes cracked open, looking, and I felt Paige looking too. We made eye contact, and she leaned toward me. "David," she whispered, and she pointed at the upholstered cushioned wood we knelt on. "You ever wonder why they call this a pew?" I puckered my lips, felt my face getting hot. I bit my tongue, using the pain to distract me from laughing. Grammy was looking at us, shaking her head, and it looked like she, too, was trying not to laugh. And when Paige saw Grammy's face, Paige let out a little croak of laughter. Loud enough for the priest to hear, loud enough to turn heads, loud enough for the person who ripped one to know they were caught.
Thank you for reading that. That was one of the passages where I actually laughed out loud. So that actually makes me want to ask you about the humor in this book, because as much as it's got a lot of really dark and hard parts, it's funny all throughout the book. So is that something that is just you? Have you always been a funny kid, or are you really employing it to balance out things in the book, just the use of humor and how you treated it?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't consider myself to be a funny person. Like humor is such like a subjective thing. Like I feel like the moment you try to make somebody laugh, like you just fail at it. But like for me, like I feel like the funniest things to me are like the irreverent things, like things that like happen that shouldn't happen in a space that has defined like expectations like for how to behave, right? Like farting in church and like somebody
Yeah.
laughing at it, like that's funny. And so like when I was writing the book, like I just tried to look for moments where I would probably laugh at something like that. You know, like that's just one moment, but like I didn't, and so I looked for those moments, but I like not just to be funny, but because they're needed. Like when you have so much trauma or tragedy, like it's like your reader is bound to get like just too heavy with it. And that's where humor comes in. Humor sort of like deflates it and lifts you up. And I heard somebody say once, it's like if you can make somebody laugh, you can get them to follow you anywhere. And humor is medicine. It's always been a medicinal thing for everybody. I imagine everybody has at least one memory where something bad happened, and at the end of their giant crying fit, they're just laughing about something, right? Like it's always this outpouring of something. And so I tried to do that in the book. I tried to look for moments where I could get right where I would laugh, but we're also I hoped a reader would too, to alleviate, a lot of the darkness in the book.
There is that one scene where mom is just losing it and laughing at stuff that's not terribly funny, but it's funny that she
Yeah.
can't stop laughing at it. That's just so a recognizable feeling. So that was great. Another part in the passage that I wanted to ask about is the use of some Penobscot phrases and terms, and you do sprinkle those in throughout the book. Was that something you grew up with, that have certain words that you would just use, or how did you go about picking what you put in there to kind of add that authenticity?
Yeah, so I mean, I never, even considered it like I was aware that you could take and use language in a way to make something feel authentic, and like that was never my goal. Like everything I put in this book, when it came to language, came to like it always came down to, well, would I have said this? Would I have heard it this way? Like my mom, like anyone on the res, if they're talking to a younger boy, they'll call him Gwus, or
Mhm.
Gwus's. Gwus means boy, Gwus is little boy, or girl does is. I grew up hearing those. My grandmother was always saying Michigan whenever something, bad, whenever, you could say damn it or something like that would be the word she used. What else? Yeah, I think every word that's in there is true to the way that I heard it. And it was actually interesting, is like there were actually moments where I was like, oh wow, I didn't know I knew this like saying. Like there's in a jar, Paige says to David when he's like standing outside the door, he's like BD gay, which means come in. And like I never knew I knew that. And I when I wrote it, I was like, I have to double check. And I like reached out to Carol Dana, who's
Mhm.
um, a, a language bearer and cultural bearer. And she was like, yeah, that's how you say it. And I was like, huh. And it's so weird to think that this language, like I had heard it at some point and it was like in my subconscious, buried deep down, and writing allowed it to come out. A very, very strange thing to think about.
Yeah, you got imprinted.
Yeah, yeah.
So here's a comment and a question from my colleague, Maine Public Radio jazz host Rich Tozier. And he says, this is a riveting collection. Each story can stand alone, but together the book can be considered as a mosaic of a novel. Especially of note is Morgan Talty's minimalist style. His descriptions of the most mundane activities, cooking a meal, describing a room, sharing a cigarette, do not divert from or flatten the narratives. A rereading of the stories clearly reveals how deliberately Talty has put them together. There are no loose ends or flowery, wasted prose here. My question is, how and why did Morgan Talty develop and utilize this particular style?
It's a good question. I think the truthful answer has to do with my lack of early education. Like when I was in high school, like I just was not, there were a lot of things that impeded my ability to succeed there. And so when I went to Eastern Maine Community College, I felt like I had this immense amount of like I had to catch up. Um, and I don't know, I just like maybe it was my lack of like vocabulary, like what I knew for like language. But like I was always drawn to like writing that was simple, that was not cluttered, that didn't have, the flowery, prose, which when done right is beautiful. But I was just always like I read Raymond Carver, right, and Anton Chekhov, and Dennis Johnson, and like you look and like every word, like you cannot get rid of it. Like that word is needed, and like if you put an extra word in, it just like takes away the whole sentence. And so like I was just always so fascinated with how, a single word can do so much. And you know I'd rather do like have 1 cent words rather than 10 cent words, and same goes with sentences and paragraphs. And like I just have always been like, okay, well, if I'm going to paint this picture, how much of it can I take away before the reader can't see it anymore or can't make out what it is? And I've always, wanted to trust my reader that they could do the work, that they were, smarter than me and could, see what I was doing. And I don't know, I just gravitated towards that style. I really loved minimalistic writing. But I was also aware of its cons too. I think, while I am a minimalist writer in some degree, I do think I extend out beyond that at times, just because, one of the criticisms of it is I think it can stay too long in the literal, and, the book or the books or the stories can get stuck in the realm of symbol and never move to metaphor and ultimately transcendence, which I think is like the goal of all storytelling, right? And so I am careful to not always be a minimalist, but I am definitely at heart like just in love with that way of telling stories.
Well, since you just sounded like a professor there, I'll ask this question because you're
All
talking about
right.
metaphors and all that good stuff. Here's a question from Joe. Have any of your students critiqued your novel? And if so, what was that like?
No, no, I don't. So I don't tell them anything about like my I'll teach a creative writing class, and like the only time I'll ever bring up anything remotely related to my own writing is when I'm like trying to make a point about something that has to do with like drafting or revising or dealing with publishers and agents and stuff. And so like I mean, I haven't had nobody has been like, oh, I liked your book, but I didn't like this, or like, nobody ever critiqued the book. And I'm waiting for that day because I don't know. I just will find it funny, I think, when somebody does.
Okay, here is an email from Roberta. She is asking, I hear people saying I or so and so grew up on the island. This threw me at first, but on maps it is labeled Indian Island. I have not heard the word reservation until this book. Is reservation in usage or just used for the short stories?
It is in usage. I believe it's in usage. I mean, everybody who lives there will call it the island or the res. And uh, I mean, reservation is like, if we're thinking technically like about a reservation, it's land that is considered, as that the tribe owns it, like it's held. I'm really bad at the legalities of all this, but it is technically a reservation. It's not trust land that's held by the federal government for the tribes. It's not land that the tribes own elsewhere. But this reservation is, I feel like, usually denotes a space where the tribe has their inherent sovereignty and their jurisdiction in that specific space. And so it is marked Indian Island, and that's what it's been called, um, I guess, since white Maine people decided to call it that and put it on the map. And it's still, still people call it that. I had when I was in high school, this because I so many people don't like the term Indian, and we were saying Indian Island, and this teacher was like, well, how come you can call it Indian Island, and we can't? And he's like, because we're Indian or something. He's like, we can call it whatever we want. But yeah, I just thought that was funny.
Yeah, always these questions of terminology that come up. This actually is another place name question. This is from my colleague, Maine Public reporter Murray Carpenter. He wants to know, do people on Indian Island refer to Old Town as Overtown, or is that just the fictional name? And it seems symbolic because it's just over the bridge, or maybe I'm reading this all too literally as a representation of Indian Island and Old Town. So which is it?
Um, it's It's both. I mean, I grew up, being everybody. I still feel like people say it. They're like, "Are you going over town?" Like that's just what they would say. Like that's how they said it. And in early drafts of the book, I always called it Overtown. But I kept it as two words, and then finally I was like, how about I just name it that? Like I'll just name Old Town Overtown because everybody on the island knows that's what they're that's what I'm talking about. And so it just was literally what people always said. They're like, are you going over town? Take me to Tim's, take me to Rite Aid, and or where are you going? You're like, I'm going over town. It just became the way we said it.
Okay, good to know. Here's a question from Paul. How does David draw on his spiritual belief background to deal with various crises that he faces? Does his faith help him cope and bring some measure of peace or clarity?
It's a good question. I feel like David is sort of in between. He's in this liminal space, I think for the David stories and even the D stories. And I feel like the only real faith I think he has, like ironically, is in people, even though it's people who have failed him. But he still nonetheless never stops having faith that, things will work out, that things will get better. And even, when we see him at his worst, when he's in the D stories, like it's still like people that he confides in, for help. And, I think, for me, I think like that in and of itself is like a spiritual, cultural aspect is, having, the courage and faith to, trust that somebody will take care of us. And I say that not as a Penobscot, cultural thing, but like an actual cultural human thing.
Mhm.
But when it comes to, specific, tribal cultural things, I think he's sort of, he's sort of on the perimeter of that. I don't think he quite he's just living. Like that's what he's trying to do.
That's what I got out of this feeling that it's not just about surviving. I mean, a lot of these folks are trying to survive, but just the trying, the effort that people put in for each other was what really kind of seemed like it shines through all of that challenge and struggle.
Yeah.
So yeah. This is probably a little late to ask this question, but I will anyway. This is from Jonathan. He says, I haven't read the book yet, but am looking forward to it. And how would you describe the book to someone who is unfamiliar with it? So we didn't get the nutshell description from you at the beginning, so you can do that now.
Yeah, so it's the best book that's ever been written. No, I don't know how to describe it. I'm really bad at describing things, but um the book is 12 stories and they're all focused on the same character, and each story is different. They all offer different you know situations. In a jar, for example, David as a young boy finds behind the steps a jar full of corn and hair and teeth, which is like this curse, and it sort of like sets into motion this all these strange happenings. There's a story with Dee and Fellis who are inspired by Antiques Roadshow to rob the tribal museum for valuable root clubs, which are if you've ever ripped like a small tree out of the ground and you see all the roots coming, you would carve that, you'd clean it up and you'd carve the ends so they were pointed and it was used as a weapon. And they see how much one of those sold for on Antiques Roadshow, so they concoct a plan to rob the tribal museum. There's a story about a geez, what else? There's a story about Dee and Fellas just trying to return a movie, but they keep having to encounter these dead caterpillars that are all squished on this road. And so there's all of these various elements and all these various stories, but at the same time, it's just, linked together, by the same place, the same people, but the same question of like, what happened to these people? Like, how did they get to where they are today?
You
I don't know
mentioned
if I
the
sold you on it, but hopefully I did.
I'm sure you did. You mentioned the dead caterpillars. I have to ask about that because that was such a striking scene, and I've just thought, oh, that's so Maine. But did you actually have that experience with dead, stinky dead caterpillars all over the road?
Not personally, but I'm pretty sure that happened in Aroostook County a couple years ago. There's a news article like I found it once. I haven't been able to find it again, but apparently a road had like was just flooded with caterpillars just crossing the street, and cars were going and they kept running them over, and it got to the point that it it was just caterpillar guts, so the road was as slick as ice. And I read that and I was like, wow, that's pretty interesting. And I went to write a story in a field of stray caterpillars, and that element, I ended up putting in there because I thought it was oddly funny, but also scary at the same time that there was that many caterpillars in one little area.
And metaphorical, kind of, or am I reading too much
Yeah,
into it?
no,
It was,
definitely metaphorical. Yeah, I think yeah, I can put my English hat on and take the writer one off and put the English one on. And yeah, but thinking about this like idea of transformation and this it's almost like, caterpillar, before they even get the chance to become a butterfly, they're just crushed to death by something that they don't even know is there, right? This external factor. Maybe hint hint, it's colonialism, not sure. But yeah.
A question that I'm sure you get a lot: who are your favorite writers?
Oh God, there's so many. I need to start just like having a list and just reading them all off. I would say Richard Van Camp, who wrote The Lesser Blessed. It's just I love that book so much. He's a First Nations writer from Canada. I love all of his work. Louise Erdrich, Tommy Orange, Therese Mayute, Tony Jensen. I'm naming all Indigenous writers right now. Brandon Hobson, Chelsea T. Hicks, N. Scott Momaday, Joy Harjo, Linda Hogan, and trying to like visually see what my library looks like in my head. Tons and tons of them. And for non-native writers, I love Raymond Carver, Alice Munro, Anthony Doerr, Anton Chekhov was sort of my first love, even though he's been dead for 200 and something years. And yeah, I love storytelling, so I'm usually drawn to a wide variety of writings and authors.
You've been compared to Louise Erdrich, so that must have been nice.
Yeah, somebody did compare me to them. I think it was Barnes and Noble did that today, and I was like, huh, well, okay, that's pretty cool. Yeah, very, very neat.
And you referred to some of them as Indigenous writers. Would you call yourself that?
Yeah, I
Or
would say I'm an Indigenous writer. And also say I'm just a writer. It's strange how it's like, Ernest Hemingway, you'd never like he was just a writer, but then you get somebody who's like not white and you're like, oh, well, they're an Asian American writer or Native American writer. And it's like we just have to categorize everything, which I get, but I also don't get. But yeah, I'm an Indigenous writer, and I always will say I'm an Indigenous writer. But then I'm also just a writer. The work I'm doing that is Indigenous writing is the same as, what an American writer is doing.
I wanted to go back to something as far as the book and the intersection between, especially David when he's a kid, and the white people who are near the reservation, right? There were some conflicts and some scenes where there's discrimination and not such great interactions. Is that realistic as well to what you experienced?
Yeah, growing up we used to, I mean, it's interesting. It's like people in Old Town, knew who was native, or could figure out and remember who was native. And I remember going to like the Y dances, and all of us from the res would always like, I don't know, get into fights with the kids that were our age but that were at Old Town. And I remember these kids came over to fight one time, and we were being led by this older kid through the woods, and he kept telling us to shut up because we were making too much noise. And he would like start marching, but like all you would hear would be him. And he'd be like, shut up. And he says, I know these woods like the back of my head. And he like mixed up the saying, and we just all lost it. And whoever was looking for us, they obviously knew where we were because he said that, and we were like, you were an idiot. But it was funny. It was really, really hilarious. But yeah, those tensions are real. Those tensions are real. They still exist. When I went to high school, it was a different story. I think maybe because people matured a little bit more, or maybe because, the majority of us in my class went to Orono and we were always together, we weren't, by ourselves, and we stuck together. But yeah, it was a thing growing up. It definitely was. And I imagine it still is.
I'm trying to squeeze in as many questions as I can. They're coming in fast. Somebody says, Chris writes, I enjoyed your book immensely. And as a high school English teacher, I often try to pair a collection of stories with a novel. What novel do you think would be a good companion for your collection?
Ooh, good question. I'm gonna go with The Lesser Blessed. I think that would be a good companion novel. It's short and it's deals with a lot of the themes that my book deals with.
Whose book is that?
That's by Richard Van Camp.
Okay, great. You had an answer right off. That's great.
I did,
And
yeah.
I'll try to get this last question in before I ask you what you're doing next. From Sheila, I'm wondering about the sister, Paige. Can you say more about her character?
Um, yeah, I love Paige as a character. I think she's people have been asking me lately, and it's strange because these questions have not been coming. These questions have just started to come. Questions about like, do you feel like you'll ever write about these people again? Like no one was asking me that, like, when the book first came out and the weeks after, like this is just like a new thing. And I keep saying like I feel like Fellis's story isn't finished in a way. In Page two, I feel like she isn't done. Not in like her, not with Paige per se. Like I'm writing another book with a female protagonist, and in many ways is like Paige, but isn't Paige. But I just care deeply for that character, and I tried to do as much justice as I could to her and to everybody in the book.
I can't resist reading this email just because it just cracks me up. But this is from Roberta. I remember visiting my mom once and I thought it was raining and went around closing windows. Turned out it was not raining, but it was the noise of caterpillars chewing on leaves.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Okay. Now I'm
That's
gonna have to YouTube that and see if I can hear it.
yeah, work it into a story someday.
Yeah.
Tell us what you're working on next.
So it hasn't been, well, I feel like everybody knows by now because I keep saying it at every event when everybody asks me this, but
Not everybody knows. You have to say it again.
yeah, I have to say it again. It hasn't been officially announced yet, but my next book, a novel called Fire Exit, will be published by Tin House in 2024. So I'm very excited about that. And besides doing edits on that and getting the book ready, I am working on an essay collection, sort of, I guess, in the style of like David Sedaris. I think that, it's just I'm telling family stories, I guess, the ones that I find funny, the ones that I think are people would like to hear. And I'm also working on another novel that deals with child welfare practice particularly when it concerns Indigenous children in Maine.
Well, great. That's very exciting. All kinds of good stuff and different formats that you're still working with. So, well, thank you so much, Morgan. It's just great talking with you. Great to read your book. I was telling somebody today, the thing about your book is it's the kind that sticks with you and is just very unforgettable. So congratulations on that.
Well,
And
thank you so much.
it was just really good to hear your insights. So thank you. And thank everybody who joined us today and those of you who sent in questions and participated in the Maine Public All Books Considered Book Club. Don't forget to stay tuned for our next one. It's in late November, and our host, Jennifer Rooks, will be talking with John Cariani about his book, Almost Maine. Some people may have seen his play. Very funny and delightful. So stay tuned and come back and join us again. And thank you. Good night.
Thank you all.